Hey everybody, tonight I wanted to focus in a little bit on trying to figure out where Bryan may have gotten rid of the murder weapon and the clothing he was wearing. Now, I don't necessarily think he got rid of the clothing and the weapon in the same spot. I do think this is something that we can narrow down to some extent based off of the information we have from the affidavit and the cell phone pings telling us the whereabouts of Bryan immediately after the crimes, specifically in the first 36 hours after the crimes occurred. I do have two scenarios that I want to present to you all. I have what I think is the most likely scenario first. But I do think it is a possibility that scenario 2 could have taken place because there could be an error in the actual affidavit. And we just don't know for sure if it's an error or if it is accurate. So that kind of is a big difference maker on where I think Bryan may have gone to dispose of the evidence. So we're going to focus in here on specifically the movements of Bryan before and after the crime and the timing on how the crimes occurred and where Bryan was at various times of day. So based off of cell phone pings, we do know that Bryan left his apartment at approximately 2:47 a.m. on the morning that these murders occurred. And it was at that time that his phone was presumed to be turned off so that it could not be tracked. It's about a 15-minute drive from Pullman, Washington to Moscow, so I believe Bryan arrived in Moscow near the house where the crimes occurred right around 3:04 to 3:05 a.m. I think that when Bryan arrived at about 3:04 a.m., he was surprised to see that there was still the amount of activity that there was that evening. There were some parties going on, and there were still some students who were heading home and walking around, and there was even an encounter in a park nearby the house where the police were talking to some underage drinkers and had issued some citations. It's very possible that Bryan saw this activity going on from 3:04 until about 4 a.m. and was kind of just waiting for things to quiet down before he was ready to make his move. I'm thinking that about 4 a.m. things were getting quiet and Bryan decided to position his vehicle for a quick escape. And this is why he was seen on surveillance footage kind of moving his car and doing a 3-point turn and getting into a spot where he could park. So from here, I think he made his way around the back of the house and entered the home, and the murders occurred approximately 4:05 a.m. to 4:20, 4:25 a.m., depending on timestamp of the cameras that they have for evidence. So Bryan would have fled the scene between 4:21 and 4:25 a.m. There is video footage of a white Elantra leaving the scene. Now, Bryan did take the long way around to get back to Pullman. He didn't take the short 15-minute direct route home. He went all the way around, and it was approximately an hour drive for him to get home after the murders occurred. Now, we do know that he drove straight home because there is video surveillance footage of the vehicle in the area going through the WSU campus, and then it's presumed that he arrived at his apartment at approximately 5:36. And based off of the cell phone pings on the route, he really wouldn't have had time to stop or do anything, so it's my assumption that he drove just the long way around, but he did go straight home. I do think at this point, when he arrived home at about 5:36 in the morning, he still had all of the evidence on him or in the car. So at this point, it's about 5:40 a.m. So I think between 5:40 and 8:30 in the morning, Bryan was taking a shower and gathering the evidence from the crime in order to prepare to dispose of it. Now, I really wish I could have been a fly on the wall in Bryan's apartment at about 8 o'clock in the morning when I think he realized that he didn't have the sheath. I think at this moment he started to do a double check everywhere to look for it, and then he realized that he may have left it or dropped it at the crime scene. So I think at about 8:55, Bryan heads back to Moscow, and he arrives at about 9:12 a.m., with the intention of trying to find the knife that he's hoping he may have just dropped nearby where he parked the car. He was there for about 10 minutes from 9:12 until roughly 9:21. I do think it's very possible that he saw new cars at the house that weren't there before, and when he looked around the area where he had parked, he did not find the sheath, so he left about 9:21 to head back home. I think it was at this point that Bryan realized he really had to scramble to get rid of whatever evidence was left. So from here, Bryan gets back home at approximately 9:33 in the morning, and I think from 9:33 until 11:35, he was gathering up any evidence that was around the apartment and from the vehicle, maybe putting it into a bag or something, loading it up into the car with the intention of heading down to Clarkson in order to clean up the car and get rid of the evidence. So we know that Bryan was in Clarkston, Washington, near the Kate's Cup of Joe coffee stand at approximately 12:36 because he was captured on video surveillance. Now, I do think that Bryan could have potentially left Pullman at about 11:35 a.m., which would have put him in Clarkston around the 12:20 or 12:25 mark. So there's a period of about 10 to 15 minutes before he's captured on surveillance footage that I believe Bryan could have been getting rid of the murder weapon. Now, I did spend some time looking at the map near where Bryan was captured on video surveillance near Kate's Cup of Joe, and there is one spot that I feel would be an ideal location for somebody who wanted to go throw something into a river without really being noticed too much. Directly behind Kate's Cup of Joe is a driving range, and just off of that driving range there's a dock and there's a recreational kind of parking area. This would be an area where somebody could drive in and out of and have easy access to the waterfront without looking too conspicuous in what they were doing. It's my assumption that Bryan drove around to this area. Now, there are signs on this road that point you to this kind of recreational area. It's a port, so this would not be something that would be very hard for Bryan to find just kind of driving into town. Even if he wasn't familiar with the area, it would have been a spot where he could have easily kind of stumbled upon it when trying to find a good access to where the water was. I think it's very possible that as Bryan arrived here in Clarkston, Washington, he was looking for a waterfront access, and when he found it here behind Kate's Cup of Joe, he would have driven in and disposed of just the murder weapon. I think it would have been very easy for him to throw just the knife into the Snake River, but putting the clothing and those other items into the water, I don't necessarily think he would have done that, because that would have taken a little more planning of weighting it down in some sort of a bag, and I don't necessarily think that's how he disposed of the clothing. But I do think that Bryan could have very well thrown the knife into the Snake River right here behind the driving range behind Kate's Cup of Joe. So after Bryan passes by Kate's Cup of Joe, he is again seen on surveillance footage at 12:46 p.m. at the Albertsons. He goes inside the Albertsons and he's captured on camera in the store from 12:46 until about 1:04 p.m. purchasing unknown items as far as we know. I would assume that Bryan was probably buying cleaning items at Albertsons in order to clean out the inside of his vehicle. Now keep in mind, Bryan has been awake for approximately 26 hours at this point. So Bryan finishes up at Albertsons at about 1:04 p.m. So from about 1:04 until about 5 p.m., we don't quite know what Bryan was really doing. Now, I do think from about 1:15 until about 5, Bryan was most likely cleaning out the inside of his vehicle, wiping things down, kind of doing the finishing touches on cleaning up any blood trace evidence in the car. And I think he spent some time most likely driving around Clarkston, Washington, disposing of some of that evidence in various trash bins throughout the city. Now this is where that second scenario comes into play that I mentioned. The affidavit actually says that Bryan's cell phone pinged in Johnson, Idaho, which is about 90 minutes away from Clarkston. But there's also a Johnson, Washington, which is in the direct route back to Pullman from Clarkston, and it's also on the route that Bryan would have taken the morning of the murder when he took that long way around home. So we don't know if the affidavit has a typo and it was meant to be written as his phone pinged near Johnson, Washington. But if it's not a typo, and his phone did indeed ping near Johnson, Idaho, that opens up a whole nother door as far as a theory on where he could have gotten rid of the evidence, which I'm going to share with you here at the end of the video. For now, I'm discussing scenario 1, and that being that Bryan disposed of the knife in the Snake River behind the driving range, and then proceeded to dispose of the other evidence in various trash bins throughout Clarkston, Washington. So under the assumption that there is a typo in the affidavit, Bryan would have left Clarkston at approximately 5 o'clock, and he would have passed Johnson, Washington at about 5:36, and then that would have put him home just before 6 o'clock. Now at this point, everybody, he would have been awake for 32 hours. I think Bryan would have arrived back at his apartment approximately 6 p.m. and he was probably exhausted at this point, and I think he probably maybe ate some food and tried to lay down and just kind of clear his mind and get a little bit of rest. Now, his phone was turned off from approximately 5:36 when he passed Johnson until about 8:36 that evening. I think that after getting home and being exhausted and laying down for a little bit, not being able to sleep, he probably got up at about 8:35 and turned his phone back on in order to see what was going on with the case. Now from here, I think he was checking the news and seeing if there was anything going on with the case, and then he eventually ended up calming down and was able to get some sleep, and then we don't know what he did in the following days after that. Now that was scenario 1, based off the assumption that the affidavit would have had a typo, and instead of writing Johnson, Idaho, they meant to write Johnson, Washington. Now that would have put Bryan passing by Johnson, Washington at 5:30 p.m. Now scenario 2 would mean that there was not a typo in the affidavit, and they did mean to put Johnson, Idaho. Now that would mean that Bryan was in Johnson, Idaho at 5:36 p.m. Now if we look at Johnson, Idaho, it is not impossible to think that he could have driven there. It's only about a 90-minute drive, and this would be an ideal location if Bryan were looking to take the route of burning the evidence that he had. Now for scenario 2, I do still think the idea that Bryan threw the knife into the Snake River still applies. The only difference here is rather than Bryan disposing of the other evidence, i.e. the clothing and those types of organic pieces of evidence, he could have potentially burned those items. Now if the affidavit is accurate and Bryan did ping in Johnson, Idaho, that would be an ideal location for Bryan to have gone to in order to burn the evidence. Keep in mind, if you're burning evidence like that, it's a very noticeable thing to do, so you would want to do that in a secluded location where people wouldn't necessarily notice you. Now Johnson, Idaho is known for its gravel pits, and there's actually a gravel pit right off of the main road that leads into Johnson that I think would be an ideal place for somebody to pull into if they were looking to burn something without being noticed. So if Bryan were to have arrived in Johnson at approximately 5:36, it's very possible that that's when he shut off his phone, and from 5:36 until about 8:36 he was disposing of the evidence. That's when his phone was turned back on, and then he was heading back to Pullman, and he would have arrived back in Pullman at approximately 10 or 10:30 p.m. that evening. Now, both of these scenarios would have Bryan being awake for 36 to 40 hours straight, so I do think that his judgment could have been impaired by fatigue. I do think it's very possible that Bryan disposed of some of the evidence in various trash bins in Clarkston, Washington, but I also think that he could have driven out to Johnson, Idaho, and potentially burned some of that evidence. That's why I really want to share it with all of you. We have so many great minds on the True Crime Time team. I want to share these theories, and then I want you all to tell me which one you think is most likely. So if you don't want to type it out, put a 1 in the comments if you think he just disposed of the evidence in Clarkston, but put a 2 in the comments if you think he drove out to Johnson, Idaho and burned it. Thanks for watching, everybody. Please let me know what you think, and I'll see you soon.